There was a time when British streets told a story. You could stand at the end of any road, whether in a quiet suburb, a bustling town centre, or a rain-soaked northern estate, and read the lives of the people who lived there simply by looking at what was parked outside. Certain cars appeared on almost every street, every school run, every Sunday morning trip to the garden centre. They were as much a part of the landscape as red telephone boxes and corner shops. These were the cars your dad drove, your uncle swore by, your neighbor cleaned religiously every Saturday morning. Some of them went on to become genuine icons of British motoring. Others quietly vanished, leaving behind little more than a faint memory and a faded photograph. Today on Britain Rewind, we're counting down 10 of those cars. Some will surprise you, but number one will take you right back. Let's begin with number 10. Number 10. Vauxhall Cavalier. The Vauxhall Cavalier was produced between 1975 and 1995, assembled primarily at Vauxhall's Ellesmere Port plant in Cheshire. It arrived at a time when British drivers were looking for something modern, practical, and reasonably affordable, and the Cavalier answered that call convincingly. It targeted the family saloon market, sitting comfortably between budget runabouts and premium executive cars. The design was clean and unassuming, the interior spacious enough for a family of 4 without feeling cramped. Drivers appreciated its smooth ride on motorways, and for many it became the default company car of the 1980s. It wasn't without fault, early models suffered from rust, and the interior trim could feel flimsy over time. But the Cavalier was everywhere. It was the sensible choice, the reliable workhorse, and for an entire generation of British drivers, it was simply the car on the drive. Number 9. Austin Maxi. The Austin Maxi, produced from 1969 to 1981, holds the distinction of being Britain's first 5-door hatchback, a genuinely forward-thinking concept that unfortunately arrived before the public fully understood what to make of it. Built at Longbridge in Birmingham, it was designed to offer practical family transport with a clever, versatile interior. The seats could fold flat to create a sleeping space, which made it popular with families who took camping holidays along British country roads. Drivers who warmed to the Maxi appreciated its practicality deeply. However, early production quality was inconsistent, and the gear linkage on many examples was notoriously imprecise. It never quite shook off a reputation for unreliability. Yet the Maxi represented something important, a British attempt at genuinely modern family motoring, and for many households in the 1970s, it was the car that held the family together on long summer journeys. Number 8. Ford Cortina. Few cars define post-war British motoring quite like the Ford Cortina. Launched in 1962 and produced in various forms until 1982 at Ford's Dagenham plant in Essex, the Cortina became the best-selling car in Britain for much of its lifespan. It was aimed squarely at the aspirational working and middle-class buyer, someone who wanted reliability, value, and a car that looked smart without costing a fortune. The Cortina was straightforward to drive and relatively simple to maintain, which made it a favorite among amateur mechanics. Its styling was influenced by American design trends, giving it a look that felt modern for its era. Rust was a persistent weakness, particularly around the wheel arches and sills, and some engine variants were thirstier than drivers would have preferred. But the Cortina was more than a car, it was a fixture of British life, present at school gates, factory car parks, and seaside holidays in equal measure. Number 7. Hillman Avenger. The Hillman Avenger was built between 1970 and 1981 at the Linwood plant near Paisley in Scotland, and it represented Chrysler UK's answer to a crowded but competitive family car market. It was a straightforward, honest machine, nothing extravagant, but nothing that would let you down without good reason. The Avenger targeted young families and budget-conscious buyers who needed reliable transport without unnecessary complexity. Its ride comfort was considered decent for the class, and the interior, while plain, was functional and well-organized. Owners occasionally reported issues with corrosion in later years, and the Linwood factory itself had a turbulent industrial history that affected build consistency. Despite these challenges, the Avenger earned quiet loyalty from its drivers. It never sought the spotlight, but in towns and villages across Britain throughout the 1970s, the Avenger was a familiar and trusted presence on the road. Number 6. Vauxhall Victor. The Vauxhall Victor was produced between 1957 and 1978 at Ellesmere Port in Cheshire, and across its 5 distinct generations it became one of the most recognizable family cars on British roads. It was aimed at the mainstream family buyer, someone who wanted more space and comfort than a small runabout could offer, without stretching to an executive saloon. The Victor's styling borrowed heavily from American influences in its early years, giving it a distinctive presence that stood out on British streets. Drivers appreciated the generous interior space and the relaxed, unhurried driving experience it provided. Rust was a serious and persistent weakness, particularly on earlier models, and some owners found the fuel consumption heavier than expected. Nevertheless, the Victor appeared on driveways across the country throughout the 1960s and 1970s, quietly serving families who simply needed a dependable, spacious car. If you've made it this far, stay with us, because one of the cars still to come was so completely woven into British daily life that its story stands apart from everything else on this list. The Victor was never glamorous, but it was genuinely trusted. Number 5. Triumph Dolomite. The Triumph Dolomite, built between 1972 and 1980 at the Canlay plant in Coventry, occupied an interesting position in the British market. It was a compact saloon with genuine character, aimed at buyers who wanted something a little more refined without stepping into full executive territory. The Dolomite's interior felt noticeably more considered than many of its contemporaries, with a level of finish that gave drivers a sense of modest distinction. The Sprint variant gained a strong following among enthusiasts. Standard models offered a relaxed, comfortable drive that suited longer journeys well. Rust was a significant issue across the range, and the cars demanded attentive maintenance to remain reliable. Nevertheless, the Dolomite attracted a loyal following: professionals, keen drivers, and those who simply wanted something with a little more personality than the average family saloon. It represented triumph at a difficult moment in British industrial history, and it carried itself with quiet dignity. Number 4. Austin Allegro. The Austin Allegro, produced from 1973 to 1982 at Longbridge in Birmingham, has become something of a cultural symbol, though not always for the right reasons. British Leyland intended it as a successor to the much-loved 1100 and 1300 range, and it arrived with some genuinely innovative features, including the unusual Quartic steering wheel found on early models. In practice, the Allegro was a car that divided opinion immediately. Families bought it because it was affordable and offered reasonable space, but many owners found themselves frustrated by reliability problems and a driving experience that rarely felt entirely resolved. The bodywork was prone to rust, and the car's somewhat unconventional appearance attracted persistent mockery in the press. And yet, and this matters, millions of British families owned one. It sat on driveways throughout the 1970s, carried children to school and luggage to holiday destinations, and for all its faults, it was genuinely part of the fabric of ordinary British life. Number 3. Ford Escort. The Ford Escort, produced in various generations from 1968 to 2004 and built largely at Halewood on Merseyside, was one of the most enduring and successful cars Britain ever produced. It was a car for everyone: young drivers getting their first taste of independence, families managing tight budgets, salespeople covering hundreds of miles a week. The Escort's appeal lay in its adaptability. It could be a humble basic runabout or, in performance trim, a genuinely exciting driver's car. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s it was consistently among the best-selling cars in the country. It was reliable enough to trust and simple enough to fix, which mattered enormously to owners who did their own servicing on weekend mornings. Rust was a persistent companion on older examples, and some later generations were criticized for losing the character of earlier models. But the Escort's place in British motoring is secure. It was part of the daily rhythm of the nation for over 3 decades. Number 2. The Austin and Morris 1100 and 1300. The ADO 16, sold as the Austin 1100 and Morris 1100, along with several badge-engineered variants, was produced between 1962 and 1974 at Longbridge and Cowley, and it stands as one of the most significant British cars of the 20th century. Designed by Alec Isagonis following his success with the Mini, it offered a revolutionary combination of front-wheel drive, hydroelastic suspension, and an exceptionally spacious interior for its external dimensions. Families adored it. The ride quality, thanks to the interconnected suspension system, was notably smooth and comfortable, and the interior space was genuinely impressive for a car of its size. It became Britain's best-selling car for much of the 1960s, a remarkable achievement that speaks to how well it understood its audience. Rust and reliability concerns grew as the cars aged, but in their prime, these cars were ubiquitous, on every high street, every estate, every school run. They defined a decade of British family motoring. Number 1. Vauxhall Viva. The Vauxhall Viva, produced between 1963 and 1979 at Ellesmere Port in Cheshire, earns its place at the top of this list not simply because of its sales figures, though those were remarkable, but because of what it represented to ordinary British families at a time when car ownership was still, for many, a relatively new and significant aspiration. The Viva was designed to be affordable, simple, and accessible, and it succeeded on every one of those terms. It was bought by factory workers, by young couples furnishing their first home, by families making their first tentative journeys to the seaside in a car of their own. The design evolved across 3 generations, each one modernizing the formula without departing from the core promise of honest, uncomplicated motoring. Owners appreciated its lightness, its ease of parking, and the straightforward nature of its maintenance. Like all British cars of the era, rust was an enemy, and reliability could vary. But the Viva's story is ultimately a human one. It was the car that brought motoring to people who had never had it before, and in doing so, it quietly changed the shape of British life. Looking back at these 10 cars, what strikes you most is not the engineering or the sales figures, it's the lives they carried. The Britain that produced and drove these cars was a country navigating genuine difficulty. Industrial disputes, economic uncertainty, the slow decline of manufacturing towns that had built their identity around making things, all of that was happening in the background while families were loading the boot for a Sunday drive or negotiating roundabouts on the school run. These cars were not luxury items. They were tools of daily life, and in many cases they were the first car a family had ever owned, the first taste of freedom and mobility that previous generations had never known. The men and women who drove them did not think of themselves as living through a golden age. They were simply getting on with things, as British people tend to do. But from here, looking back, there is something genuinely moving about those streets, those driveways, those ordinary Saturday mornings. These weren't just cars, they were chapters of a life. If this brought back a memory, leave a comment below and tell us what your dad drove. Like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to Britain Rewind if you'd like more, and we'll see you in the next one.